theory in my own life about jealousy is that when it rears its ugly head, I really try to push it away. This is advice that I gave in my Dear Sugar column. We are all savages inside. That there was a letter from a writer about her professional jealousy, and I said, that doesn't serve you. It's toxic. You need to push it down. And interestingly, I generally feel that way about jealousy across the board. But when it comes to relationships, especially romantic and sexual relationships, I take a little more discerning view of jealousy. I think that absolutely you can get out of hand with it and just be obsessively jealous about every person your partner or lover interacts with who may be of sexual interest. But I also think sometimes in my life, when I have felt jealous in romantic relationships, it was almost always right. I had a reason to be jealous. It ended up being I was jealous because there was something going on. There was some frisson or some exchange or some illicit whatever. And that feeling of jealousy led me to a deeper understanding of what was actually happening in that relationship.
That's so interesting because I fall into the, I hope not larger, but I suspect larger category of people for whom when I'm jealous, it is not actually rational. It is a kind of projection and externalization of my self-doubt. And I'm thinking in particular of the fantasy that I spun in my head for several months, which had to do with a girlfriend, a beautiful, wonderful woman who had been with for a couple of years. And I broke up with her. We drifted apart. It wasn't like she broke my heart, but she moved to a new city where a friend of mine was living. And I developed the idea that this friend of mine, who was a very handsome guy and very charming, frankly, and self-assured in a way that I could never hope to get to, because they ran in the same rough circles, that it was inevitable that he was going to meet her and that she would fall in love with him. This was crazy, but I really had this fantasy in my head, and I would think about how they might meet and in what circumstance and what he might say to her and how obvious it was that she was just going to fall for him, hook, line, and sinker. And I thought, as I was thinking about this wonderful Lydia Davis novel called The End of the Story, which is about a woman who is sort of facing the demise of a relationship with a younger lover who she is still busted up over, and she goes out into the night looking for him and trying to, run into him. And she has this line, I'm going to get it wrong, but she has this line about how sometimes on these journeys that she would go and try and seek him out, she would find him, and sometimes she didn't find him, but it always felt better to do that than to sit at home. And that, I think, is the nature of a kind of jealousy, romantic jealousy and intense friendship jealousy, that it's a kind of journey that we want to go on because we don't want to sit with ourselves.
Indeed. So that's what we're going to talk about today on this episode of Dear Sugar Radio. Jealousy, specifically the sort we get ourselves into with romances and friendships and stuff. Listening to you, Steve, I remembered really the deepest, fiercest, hottest, most irrational jealousy I've ever felt was when I had broken up with my first husband. Now, longtime listeners of the show, people who've read my work, they know it was all my fault. I broke up with him. I cheated on him. I said, This has to end.
Right.
So guess what happens? Because I'm a crazy person and because jealousy is crazy and irrational. Yes. He begins dating other women. In his heartbreak, he decides to try this thing out. And the minute I catch wind of this, I really just absolutely lose it. The idea of him going on a date with another woman so unhinged me that I can't even begin to describe how crazed I felt. I was sobbing. I was begging him not to date other women. And I was doing this even though I knew that it didn't make any sense whatsoever. I wasn't asking him to come back to me. I was asking him to continue to hold me in this one exclusive light. I can't explain it to myself. I can only report that I did have that. I did have that. And I got over it because I did realize how irrational it was, but it rose up like a great fever. So let us read about other people's fevers.
Yes, let's do some fevering.
Dear Sugars, my question is about that ugly beast jealousy. I'm a woman in my 30s who has worked hard to cultivate friendships with other women. I'm lucky to say I have an incredible community of smart, compassionate, creative, interesting, and supportive lady friends. However, I've also been fighting a lifelong battle with my jealous and competitive nature, which has caused road bumps in some of these relationships. Over the years, I've gotten better at dealing with it, but I'm sorry to say it hasn't entirely disappeared. I want to be better, more open and loving and secure, and less petty and competitive. I have a relatively new friend who's young, charming, beautiful, and brilliant. At first, and I'm not proud to admit it, these very traits made it hard for me to open up to her, but eventually we became friends, and I've come to value her greatly. It felt great to be able to see her as a human, wonderful and flawed and special, and not just a set of traits like skinny and smart, and a reflection of my own insecurities. I recently introduced her to the guy I've been seeing, and I felt like he was and has remained particularly interested in her out of all my friends. It could be projection, I know, and his behavior is definitely not blatant or inappropriate, but it's subtle, and I trust my instincts. Recently, they ran into each other, had coffee, and both told me about it. It re-sparked the jealousy, self-doubt, and competitiveness I feel with this friend. My question isn't about him or his interest or lack thereof, because there's not a lot I can do about that. People will crush on whoever they crush on. My question is, how can I make sure that my own insecurities and issues don't destroy my friendship with this woman? I legitimately care about her, and I know she cares about me too. Thanks for any thoughts. Signed, Jealous Friend.
Yeah, I could have written this letter because I've struggled so much with jealousy. That story I told about that friend of mine who, I believed was going to take up with this ex-girlfriend of mine.
They're married now, right? They have three kids?
They have beautiful, actually their children are empirically 10 times more beautiful than mine.
So back to my theory that if you're
There's
jealous, you have a reason.
always there.
I'm teasing, that's not true.
Yeah. Well, but this question does sort of blur the line because she says, it's subtle, but my instincts are good about this. So she is struggling with the idea that maybe this friend whose charms and beauty and so forth are so apparent to her, those charms and beauty are apparent to this guy who she's involved with. So that's one issue. But what she's really interested in, and I think it's so interesting that this is really the focus of it, and I think it's kind of amazing and beautiful, is that Jealous Friend is really focused on how do I keep this friendship, which is the enduring question. Maybe you'll work it out with this guy and he'll be your, important for the rest of your life, but you're going to have friendships for your entire life. And the question is, how do I negotiate those friendships when I am sometimes struck by jealousy and I'm a competitive person by nature? I think it's such an interesting question because for women, the idea of being the jealous friend is, quite taboo. There's an idea that you should just be gracious and loving and praising. And in fact, almost all friendships have an element of jealousy. And in the case of Jealous Friend, she's very blunt and in the process of reckoning with the fact that she feels a lot of jealousy and she knows that there's the risk as a competitive person. I really relate to this because I'm a competitive person too, and I know why I'm competitive. I grew up in a household with brothers where there was a lot of stated and unstated competitiveness, and you have a kind of weakness for it. If that's the way you grew up, you never quite get rid of it. What you do is you manage it. And what I hear in this letter, Jealous Friend, is your noble and honest attempts to manage that jealousy and say, I don't want this to overtake this friend of mine.
Yeah. There's no easy solution to this question. What I can say is a long conversation with yourself, Jealous Friend, that is ongoing, maybe on a daily basis, might be helpful to you. And if I were going to have this conversation with myself, here's what it would include. First of all, just reason. You know that you can't be this woman. And if your boyfriend is attracted to her for qualities that you don't possess, there's nothing you can do about that, right? And there are qualities that you possess. There's a reason your boyfriend loves you. This woman doesn't have those same qualities. So it really, when you use that word competitiveness, I think so often when it comes to love and romance, we really do think that we're, right there competing directly with other women or other men or, whoever your sort of romantic peer is when it comes to competition for partners. But when I let that go,
right.
When I realized the way to get somebody to love you is not to be the prettiest girl in the room or the smartest girl in the room or the funniest girl in the room, because here's the deal. Not everyone loves that person.
Right.
Some guys like this person sitting over in the corner, doing a crossword puzzle. And so, you really do have to let fall this essential notion that you have, Jealous Friend, that other women are the competition. And this is everywhere in your letter, that you've struggled with this from the beginning, because somewhere along the way, you conceived with this idea that other women are essentially fighting you for resources that you want to have. And that's just not true. There will be people who love you for who you are, and there will be people who love your friend for who she is. You aren't in a foot race against each other for that. And if you can talk to yourself about that and remind yourself of that at every turn, every time you have that ugly feeling, I think your life will be made better for it.
Yeah. It's interesting, the distinction that people make, I don't know, jealousy and envy are used kind of interchangeably, but the shorthand version of it is jealousy is about trying to hold on to what you already have, and envy is about trying to get something that somebody else has that you want. I think that's a little reductive, but this is an instance where the fear underneath this, and I recognize it so powerfully because as I think about it, it was exactly what was happening with my friend, who was also charming and handsome and a musician, and was with a guy like that in the world, I'll never hold on to anybody. I'll never find somebody. This guy's always going to be out there, and why would any woman be interested in me when he's out there? I bet you there are a lot of people, a lot of listeners who, have some version of this as well.
Of course, yeah.
Friends are supposed to be loyal and all that stuff, but under the surface, there is this kind of unstated sense by which that friend is a friend, but they're also a measuring stick. And what's interesting is that jealous friend, you've made friends with somebody who is, by your description, such an attractive person. I don't just mean physically attractive, but clearly charming and brilliant and all these things. And that takes a lot of guts, really. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to really be close to somebody who, just by being who she is going to arouse a lot of feelings of potential jealousy because she's attractive to people, even the guy you're seeing. And I think the question to focus it on maintaining that friendship feels to me like the right focus here, because it's the competitive anxiety. How do I contend with a world where there are people who are prettier and more charming and more intelligent than I am? And the answer that I would have is what you have on your side is the essential thing that I think is the sexiest of all, which is you know yourself.
Right.
And you are in an effort to know yourself. This, to me, is kind of like this sexy letter in the sense that I'm attracted to jealous girlfriend now because she seems to me so clear-eyed about kind of her stuff. And it's very magnetic, as you know better than anyone, Cheryl. It's very magnetic when there's another person who will confess to their own weakness, their doubts, their flaws, their sins. All right, let's hear another one of these letters. Dear Sugars, my wife of 20 years, who loves me dearly and whom I love dearly, has a best friend. He's a guy she briefly dated while we were on a break early in our relationship. He's unmarried and lives 1,000 miles away, but they talk frequently. I don't have a problem with this. I work a lot of late nights, and she's alone a lot and really needs companionship. She's had a rough life with terrible parents who she no longer talks to, and as a child she was molested and raped. We have 2 wonderful children, and my wife is one of the most honest and forthright people I've ever known. The problem is that my wife feels that her friend should be able to visit us, and despite the fact that I think he really is a good guy, I have a real problem hanging out with someone my wife has been intimate with. I'm past tense jealous in general, not present tense. I also have an obsessive side that makes it very hard not to think about my wife's sexual exploits with someone who's sleeping at my house for 3 days. Anyway, he recently came for a visit, and I promised I wasn't going to freak out. I made it through the first night quite well, but on night 2, the 3 of us were at a campfire in our backyard, and my wife sent me to get her some wine and snacks up at the house. When I came back, she was sitting on the ground, cold, wet grass, with her arms and head on one of his thighs, watching a video on his phone. I was not thrilled with this, especially since we had all sat around occasionally watching videos on phones with no one ever feeling the need to jump down on the grass and rest their head in someone's lap. On night 3, I worked till 2 a.m. and went to bed while my wife and her friend hung out at the campfire until 6 a.m. I know this because I had to help my wife to bed at that time when I woke up to her wandering the room wasted, looking for our bed. I went to work with my wife still passed out on our bed and her friend still passed out in the basement, but after she drove him to the airport later that day, I went off on her on the phone, saying that if I'd gone out to the fire the night before, I may have killed someone. So I'm the bad guy and have been apologizing for several days. I would appreciate your take on the relationship because I'm having a hard time letting go of some very negative feelings. I just think that she's kind of keeping this guy on reserve. And although I don't mind them having a long-distance relationship, I have a very hard time having him in our house. I know I've painted this picture like I'm the sucker with the cheating wife, but honestly, everyone that knows her, including me, knows she's an amazing person, not a cheater or a liar under any circumstances. But I think she's lying to herself a bit about her relationship with her friend. I believe that she is not sexually attracted to him, but I still feel this relationship is hurting our marriage. What are your thoughts? Signed, Jealous Husband.
Jealous husband. I don't think you're past tense jealous. I think you are present tense jealous.
Yeah.
And maybe for some good reasons.
Yeah.
The word boundaries kept coming into my mind as I read your letter. Your wife doesn't have to be messing around with this friend of hers in order to need to listen to you when you say you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Okay? You aren't accusing her of infidelity. You're accusing her of not making you feel safe in your own home when they're together.
Right.
And I would say, based on the things you've described, I too would feel uncomfortable. Okay? So I trust my husband. We have relationships with women who he's slept with in the past, long time ago. And I would feel uncomfortable if the three of us were sitting by a campfire and I'm sent up to the house to get the wine and then I come back and he's sort of lounging on one of their laps. You know, I think that there is such a thing as the two of you sitting down and saying, yes, your friend can come visit, but we need to set boundaries. You need to hear me, that I need to feel comfortable with the way you interact with this guy when he's in our house and maybe even on the phone. You know, I think to say things like, yeah, I don't want you hanging out with him till 6 a.m. I mean, to me, that feels risky to me, frankly. Would you feel comfortable with that, Steve?
Well, I might, but I guess what it would depend on is the next thing, which is how she feels about all this and the meaning of this relationship to her with this friend. You're absolutely right, Jealous Husband. She's not just keeping this guy in reserve. He's there doing the work of keeping her company and talking with her at this campfire. And really, in a sense, he's appropriating the role that I think she probably wishes you were playing. Think about the ways in which some of this is kind of choreographed by your absence. I'm not suggesting that you don't have a right to work late and that there's anything suspect about working hard. You just should recognize that part of what your wife is telling you is that she feels emotionally neglected. I think that should be a part of the discussion that you have along with boundaries, because you're both consenting to choreographing a situation that's designed to drive you a little crazy. It might be a way in which unconsciously probably your wife is trying to say to you, I need more attention from you. And if I can't get your attention, through directly communicating that to you, I'm going to tell you by resting my hand or head on this guy's thigh that I know is going to excite a certain kind of jealousy. This is not exactly unprecedented. It is a bad way of trying to communicate, but people do this all the time, where they really want attention from their partner, and the way they know to elicit it, especially if it's a man, because we tend to be more possessive and competitive, is to flirt with another guy, or in this case, have an ongoing relationship and have in your home somebody who she knows is a charged figure for you.
Well, and I think, too, you see this in the dynamic Jealous Husband. You said you wouldn't freak out, and then by day 3 you freaked out.
Right.
And you set this up because the two of you never really unified as a couple when it comes to how this friend is going to exist in your life. And because this friend is in your wife's life, he is in yours too. So, you accept that they're friends. You respect the fact that she feels close to him. You respect the fact that she wants him to visit. Now, the next part of this equation is you need to respect yourself enough to make sure that your wife is hearing
Bingo.
What you need.
Yeah.
You call yourself jealous and immature and possessive and all these things. But actually, I think you sound like a pretty great guy. You say you're traditional, but most traditional husbands aren't really cool with their wives frequently spending hours on the phone with ex-lovers. And he's not even like a far, far back ex-lover. He's a lover who really was involved with your wife when you were involved with her. You were on a break. So I just want to say, I think that you have been really great and open-minded with this friend who clearly your wife values. And I think, everything you say about your wife and how she's this amazing person and she's forthright. And so she sounds to me like the kind of woman who can really hear this conversation that you need to have with her, saying, okay, we've got all of these great qualities as a couple, and we need to do better because we're having this fight because your friend visited and I don't feel safe, and you're pissed off that I don't trust you. Okay, right. This is not the end of something bad. This is the beginning of something deeper, better.
One other thing, Cheryl, that I'm interested to get your take on. You know, he says he's very concerned with obsessive is the word he uses, previous lovers, like her sexual history. And one thing that's mentioned very quickly in the letter and never dwelled on is that she was molested and raped when she was younger. I wonder if you feel maybe that's something that should be discussed as well.
It's interesting. I wondered about that line because, honestly, I don't know how it's relevant to this situation.
Right.
Not just about her experience being raped, but she had a rough life with terrible parents, and as a child, she was molested and raped, jealous husband writes. And I don't know how that sentence fits into this puzzle, why he included it, why we need to know about her past. But, you know, jealous husband, you might want to think about why you included that line. I mean, I think maybe only the two of them can answer. And what's cool about this couple is I actually feel like they have the capacity to answer it. They seem like an emotionally awake pair.
Yeah, and you know, jealous husband, you're already 100 miles in front of the pack by saying, I am immature and somewhat possessive. Most people who are immature and somewhat possessive are unaware that they are immature and somewhat possessive. You know, as actually does our first letter writer, you know, jealous friend, she's aware that this is a trouble spot for her, that she is prone to jealousy, to externalizing that self-doubt and locating it outside of herself. Maybe the question for you, and it's a different set of questions for your wife, maybe the question for you is, why, if I know that I'm immature and somewhat possessive, why, if I know I'm hung up on the partners that my wife has been with, did I invite this guy into my house for 3 days, and did I then leave the premises in various ways for long stretches of time? Is there a way in which I was trying to provoke a conflict or get said something that I need to say?
And I think that, you know, with both of these letters and with the stories that we each told, me being crazy jealous of the guy I just dumped, you know, how dare he go in and dating somebody else, and you imagining this whole story of your friend somehow meeting this woman and dating her. These are irrational thoughts. All of us acknowledge their irrationality, but what sits beneath them is something truer and something that's not irrational. And that is usually a desire, a fear, a vulnerability. It's something that we need to address in our lives or in our relationships. You know, I think that this dynamic between this couple, it's something they need to address together. With a friend, I think it's a conversation she needs to have with herself. With you, how did you solve that old problem in the end?
I think what happened, as often happens, is it was an intense manic obsession for several months that was really about the fact that I was lonely and I felt that I'd made a mistake and that I was never going to get this person back who I had essentially kind of broken up with. But just because you break up with somebody doesn't mean that you don't still, as you can speak to, that you don't still want them to be loyal to you and that they still aren't in some way a measure of your worth. And, you know, I think what happened is slowly but surely I started to do a little better and feel less crappy about myself and down on myself, and just naturally these crazy manic fantasies diminished. It was really, the jealousy was symptomatic of a few-month period where I was really feeling like I'm never going to find love. I'm never going to be proved worthy of love.
Yeah. And for me, what I realized is I wasn't jealous. I was sad. I was really sad because when my ex-husband started dating other women, something big was over.
Yeah.
It really hurt when it ended. And there's almost always something else that sits beneath jealousy is the point.
Yeah.
And, you know, for jealous husband, I keep going back to this word boundaries. I think that you haven't articulated in calm, rational terms what it takes for you to feel safe about this friendship your wife has. And you need to. Because it's not going to work. What you're doing right now is suppression, explosion, suppression, explosion.
Right.
It's okay. It's not okay. It's okay. Right. It's not okay. And of course, your wife is getting angry with you about that because it's not fair to her. Right. But what is fair to her is to say, I need you to make me feel safe in this marriage, and we need to talk about that friendship.
And probably your wife needs to be able to tell you, I'm alone a lot.
Yeah.
And I need companionship.
That's right.
And fortunately, you already know that.
So write to us and tell us how it turns out, okay, jealous husband?
Last Seen, a new podcast from WBUR and the Boston Globe, investigates the largest unsolved art heist in history.
So about the time that he begins putting the duct tape on, he says, this is a robbery.
The theft of $500 million worth of art from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston.
When the FBI says, we solved it, we know who did it, it's like, no, you don't, because you don't have the paintings.
Subscribe and listen to Last Seen now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Sponsored by Samuel Adams and ADT Smart Home.
I'm Michelle Goldberg.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And I'm David Leonhardt. We're the hosts of The Argument, a new podcast from the New York Times opinion section. These days, it's more important than ever to listen to people who disagree with you. Maybe they'll teach you something new. Or maybe they'll just teach you how to beat them. So listen to The Argument from the New York Times. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to listen.